Hello once again, I'm Extra Life. Welcome back to the workbench. As you can see, I've been getting more into woodworking lately and doing a little bit of work with vintage hand tools. Now, in an age of machine tools and electronics, that may seem a little bit impractical, but I think there are actually some very good reasons, and some practical ones, why it's useful to work sometimes the old-fashioned way. And since there are not as many hand tool manufacturers as there used to be, getting into the hobby often means acquiring some vintage or even antique tools like this one. So today, I thought we would take a look at the process of how I restored this old Disston backsaw and talk about why you might want to get into hand tool woodworking in the first place. Here are a few examples of old school antique handsaws. All of these are made by the Disston company in Philadelphia. This is a rip-cut panel saw, this is a 12-inch tenon saw, and this is a 10-inch carcass saw. And the distinction, of course, is that you use a big saw like this for cutting all the way through a big piece of material, and you use a saw like this for making joinery cuts, where you're only going part way in. This is going to be a tenon saw, or I suppose you could say it already is. It will have rib teeth, which it has got, but it needs to be sharpened. And it will be used for, obviously, cutting tenons, but could also be used, I think, quite serviceably as a dovetail saw. Based on the shape of the handle and the stamp on the medallion, this saw dates from about 1885, which makes it by far the oldest thing I own. And we're going to be doing some extensive repairs on it. It needs quite a bit of repair on the upper horn of the handle here, which has been cracked. It looks like somebody dropped it at some point. Obviously, the blade and the spine need a bit of rust removal and restoring. And unfortunately, the screw threads have broken off on the medallion. I have the old saw nut for it, but this is no longer a useful part. However, I do have a repair in mind that I would like to try using these spare saw nuts that I bought, or we could just replace this altogether if we're not concerned about historical accuracy. Speaking of history, this is obviously an antique, but keep in mind that this isn't something terribly precious or rare. Disston made millions of these. It cost me about $50, and I think, for the condition it's in, that's a reasonable price, and we are going to make this into a working tool. We're going to try our best to preserve the way that it looks and its collector's value, but that's not our primary concern. We want to do some woodwork with this tool, and hopefully, after we're done repairing it, it can serve for another 120 years. So let's start by getting all this hardware off. Obviously, we're missing one saw nut here, so this medallion should just pop it out. There we go. It's got this kind of distinct shape, which is different. Newer medallions, I bought this one hoping it would work as a replacement, but it's a different shape, and the threads have just been torn off this part. And it looks like it's been twisted, so I would suspect maybe that the nut was over-torqued, except that there's no damage to the nut itself, which you would expect to see some screwdriver damage or something like that. So I'm not really sure how this failed, but we will try out repairing it in just a second. There's one. There's two. Just using a screwdriver here as a punch. I really should be using a punch. There's one. And there's two. And you can see we've got pretty thin threads on these screws. And if we compare them to the newer saw nuts that I bought, they made these much more robust after about 1890 or something like that. But I think due to the problem we are experiencing today. We should be able to get the whole blade looking as shiny as those shiny spots. We will see about that. Handle is in pretty good condition. The wood is quite dry. It's about ready for a refinish. It's starting to powder by these fastener joints. But all of these look like they're in great shape. The only problem I anticipate, of course, is that the larger threads on these screws mean we're going to have to drill out both the holes in the saw plate and this hole right here to accept a larger diameter thread. Anyway, now that we've got this all apart, let's see if we can Frankenstein together a new medallion out of the old medallion and one of these new saw screws. So why might you be interested in hand tools in the first place? Apart, I think, from the obvious reason that they're cool. They are really quite a joy to use. I mean, they're the result of hundreds of years of iteration and design by craftsmen and toolmakers, and in that sense, it's about as close to perfection in design as you're likely to encounter. But apart from that, I think there are some practical reasons to use them. One of the obvious ones, of course, is that they don't require electricity. You can use them anywhere. You never have to bring an extension cord with you. You are never going to run out of batteries in the middle of a project. And it lets you work in places sometimes that you might not otherwise be able to. I think whenever possible, it's always more fun to work outside. Another huge advantage of hand tools is they create so much less noise and dust than their machine counterparts. Whenever you're using power tools, you pretty much have to be wearing earplugs and a dust mask and eye protection, which can be uncomfortable or impractical, and it creates a whole lot more mess for you to clean up later. And the noise that they make is really uncomfortable to be around and can damage your hearing if you're too close to them. Not to mention it can create all kinds of problems between you and your neighbors, so using hand tools is a great way to bring down the volume of your work. So here is the medallion I'm trying to fix up. As you can see, I've got the screw threads removed, and then I've got the other half here with just the screw thread portion, and that is also flattened, and I have checked to make sure that these meet at a nice 90-degree angle. And what I'm going to try and do is solder them on to one another using this little helping hands device. Now, I should preface this by saying that I really have no idea what I'm doing and no idea whether this will work. And ideally, obviously, we would be welding or brazing this as it's a structural part, but it doesn't really need to hold that much force in tension because it's more like a pin really than a screw. The saw blade fits in there already. It doesn't need to be pinched tight. So most of the load is actually a shear load on this threaded part, and not much is actually being applied to the face. This is mostly decorative. Alright, hopefully you can see that okay. I've got a little kind of horseshoe of solder hanging over the top of it. I've got the pieces aligned so that I think they're centered and orthogonal, and I put a little bit of flux in the joint. Now I'm just going to light this candle and get the flame about as close as I dare. Starting to bubble there a little bit. See the flux kind of melting. Alright, the butane is working where the candle flame did not. Starting to see that solder melt into place now. And wow, starting to see a fillet form. That looks great. I don't know if you can see that at all, but quite a bit more blackened than it was. I'm going to let that cool down just a bit. And look at that, the two parts are holding together. Assume this is still pretty hot. Of course, butane burns a little bit hotter than a candle flame does. I thought that was mostly for the butane torch type, you know, the cigar lighters with the high pressure blue flame, but apparently this does the trick. Just about good as new. I think that looks really quite nice. Alright, so the next step is the messy one. We're going to start trying to remove some of this surface rust from the saw blade itself, and to help us out we're going to use a little bit of vinegar. Another reason I like using hand tools is that you actually get some exercise while you're using them. You are required to do the work yourself, and certainly some people might see that as a disadvantage, and after a long day maybe it seems more like that. But using power tools can be fatiguing as well, but often in different ways. I don't really think you're getting a good workout. You're not really burning that many calories. You're just holding yourself in uncomfortable positions for longer periods of time. If you're using something like a power planer or a chop saw, you might even expose yourself to RSI, repetitive strain injury. While the same risks are present using hand tools, you're getting a lot more of a workout, and you feel a lot better at the end of a day when you've been sawing something by hand than you do after spending several hours using a table saw. Alright, after a little more polishing and prep, here is the finished surface, and in the background here you can see this is the saw I previously restored, but there's one last thing to do, and that is to enlarge the hole for the new screw threads that we put on the medallion. I don't know about you, but I hate drilling through sheet metal. It always seems to get really chattery, especially when you're enlarging a hole that's already there. Add to that the fact that this isn't just aluminum, but tool steel, making it a really difficult metal to drill. So while we're at the drill press, we might as well drill out this medallion slot, because the threads on the screw are slightly too big to fit into that as it is. In order to repair this damage, we are going to have to cut off a big slice of this, probably on a diagonal here, maybe 45 degrees, and then put in some other wood to replace it. And I have this scrap of walnut that has been sitting in my scrap bin for a while. These Disston handles are made of apple wood, but walnut is, you know, similar hardness and looks about the same color. So now we have some reference for that. And that is the piece we're going to cut off. So, using hand tools is certainly more fun, but is it more practical? And I think that really depends on how many of something you're building. For me, I'm mostly doing exactly one of something, and I think a lot of craftspeople certainly are. And in that case, I think that the advantage of using power tools isn't necessarily quite as strong as you might think. If you factor in all of the time that you spend setting them up, changing out the bits, you know, making sure that your fence is tuned up properly, and doing clamping and making sure that you have enough room to run the power tool the whole length of cut and so forth. There's actually a lot of overhead of being able to use power tools properly and safely that you just don't have if you're using hand tools. When you need to use a handsaw, you pretty much just grab the saw, walk over to the wood, put it in the clamp, and start cutting. There's not too much thinking or extra setup that needs to go into using them. And so if you have a project that takes longer using hand tools, the amount that it takes longer is usually by a few minutes, not a few hours. And I suppose my final reason for preferring hand tools a lot of the time is a practical one, but also a personal one that should sort of be evident from the subject of the video, of course, which is a 120-year-old handsaw, and that is that hand tools often last longer. You can repair them. They don't have these complicated specialty moving parts that you can only source from a manufacturer. They're just basically hunks of raw metal and wood, and you can work them like you would any other material. I don't know that the folks at the Disston factory in 1886 were necessarily thinking about sustainability as a goal of their manufacturing process, but the fact is, they have produced a tool which lasts a great deal longer than its modern counterpart, and in an age of planned obsolescence and cheap disposable tools, it's really nice and very satisfying to know that the tool you're using will possibly outlive you. And doubly so because it's not that this tool is, more expensive or more valuable or made out of rare materials that it lasts longer, but because it's simpler. It is a simple design that has lasted the test of time already by dint of it still being around. So those are a few practical reasons for using hand tools. Maybe you agree, maybe not. To me, the most important one still is just that I enjoy it. And, sometimes that's enough. Alright, I think that is looking pretty good. Feels nice to the touch. It blends smoothly where it needs to blend. So I think I'm ready to clean this up and put some new finish on it. In the meantime, we can also put a little bit of wax on the blade itself. Yes, that's right, wax on metal. And this will just kind of prevent rust from forming on the surface of the blade and also help it slide a little bit more easily when it's in the kerf of the wood. Alright, this saw is back together, and in principle the next step we ought to do when restoring it is to sharpen it. However, this saw, surprisingly enough, is actually very sharp already. It feels like it is very ready to cut, which is sort of surprising given the condition it was in, but clearly it was sharpened and then put away in storage for a long time where it picked up some rust. But I think I could probably just start cutting with it now. However, it does feel a little bit weird to end this video without at least showing you the principle of sharpening the thing. So I'm not going to go into great detail. We'll just hurry through the basics as this video is kind of getting a little bit long in the tooth already. Oh, come on, that was good. So this is just a piece of hardwood with a slot cut almost all the way through, and we can slide the saw into the vice jaws. It's a little bit delicate, this operation. And then we can just clamp on these boards, and the saw is held in place, and we can get access to it with a file. So you can see the saw is held quite nicely, and there's a little bit of clearance below it so that when we set a file on top, we're not filing super close to the plane of the workbench itself. So here's our file. It is a triangular file. So I'm going to set the file perpendicular to the blade of the saw. And now there are some angles here that we could adjust in theory. We could adjust the fleam of the saw, and this is something that we would do on a crosscut saw. Each tooth would have alternating fleam. On this, which is a rip cut saw, we're not going to worry about that. And also the pitch, which is when we rotate it sort of forward and backward. Typically we want to have a slight forward pitch on most of the teeth, and then on the teeth near the front of the saw blade we want to have less pitch, so it's gentler up here and more aggressive back here. So typically when we're filing, we would start at the front of the saw and then work our way back and hit every gullet on the way to make sure that they're all even. In this case, we're just going to take down this one tooth. Hopefully you can see it. So I'm going to do the gullet on the back and the gullet in the front. So we'll set our saw in the groove, adjust the angle, and then we're going to push. So the file cuts on the push stroke and take some off the back of that tooth. All right, that's about right. So now I'm going to hit these other teeth and make these nice and even. Now let's try making a rip cut in this soft piece of pine. Start by kind of slowly dragging the teeth back and forth on one corner. We'll work into the cut. A nice clean cut. My hand kind of wandered towards the beginning there, and I ended up with an angle on that, so I need to work on my saw technique. But I'm very pleased with the definition of that cut. I think it came out just perfect. Alright, and just for fun, let's cut some hardwood. Here's a scrap of live oak with some gnarly twisting grain in it. Alright, I think that's quite a respectable result. Surface is nice and clean, doesn't need any planing, and I would maybe consider making the teeth a little bit more aggressive if I refile that saw. Took quite a while to get through this, but we are going across the grain in the hardest wood that I've got, so I think that's good enough for now. Well, there you have it. That is my take on restoring an antique tenon saw. I think this came out really well. I'm very pleased with the way it cuts and also with the way the handle came out. I think it makes a wonderful complement to my little carcass saw, and who knows, maybe one day I will get a little dovetail saw and complete the set. But in the meantime, I really want to get doing some woodworking. As always, I want to say a huge thanks to my supporters over on Patreon who make this possible. It really means the world to me to have your support. And if you're interested in getting early access to new videos as well as a little bit of bonus content, head on over to patreon.com/extralife and become a supporter today. I hope you guys enjoyed that look at restoring this handsaw and made some plans to maybe make some sawdust in your own workshops this spring. So, thanks very much for watching. I will see you next time.